Welcome to Underworld UK, where Britain's darkest stories are brought to light. From the gritty streets of gangland London, Liverpool, Manchester and Birmingham, from Curtis Warren to the Cray twins to county lines and modern day true crime, we cover everything. Bringing you new videos every week. Subscribe so that you'll be notified when the next video is put out.
Imagine being a prison officer and arriving for work knowing that one inmate requires a team of officers in full riot gear just to escort him to court. Imagine dealing with a prisoner who accumulated almost 100 disciplinary sanctions behind bars, who allegedly attacked officers, assaulted a prison governor, spent years under 23-hour lockdown, and became so unpredictable that prison authorities believed he could no longer mix safely with other inmates. He wasn't serving multiple life sentences. He wasn't the head of a powerful crime syndicate. Yet over the years, newspapers and criminal justice reporters began referring to him as one of Ireland's most dangerous prisoners. So how does someone earn a reputation like that? How does a talented young boxing champion transform into one of the most feared inmates in the Irish prison system? Was Brendan Cummins simply born violent, or is his story a disturbing example of what can happen when childhood trauma, unchecked aggression, and years inside prison collide? Today, we're examining the life of the man whose name became synonymous with danger inside Ireland's prisons, Brendan Cummins. Over the years, newspapers would describe him as one of Ireland's most dangerous prisoners. Prison officers would come to know him as one of the most difficult inmates they had ever encountered. Courtrooms would routinely see him escorted by teams of officers dressed in full protective equipment, carrying riot shields as if preparing for a public order incident rather than escorting a single prisoner. But how does someone reach that point? How does a talented young boxer become a man considered too dangerous for the normal prison population? And perhaps the biggest question of all, was Brendan Cummins simply a violent criminal who made a series of bad choices? Or was he someone whose life had been heading towards disaster long before he ever entered a prison cell? To understand that, we need to go back to the beginning. Brendan Cummins wasn't born into the criminal underworld. He spent the first years of his life in Manchester before his family eventually moved back across the Irish Sea to Dundalk, County Louth. According to accounts presented later in court, his childhood was far from stable. His father was reportedly a violent man, and his defence team would later tell the court that Brendan had witnessed things no child should ever have to witness. Those experiences didn't excuse what he would eventually become, but they did provide some insight into the environment he grew up in. For many children exposed to violence, sport becomes an escape. For Brendan, that sport was boxing. Inside the ring, he wasn't known as a troublemaker. He was known for his talent. He became a 6-time Louth and Meath boxing champion and won the Leinster title on 2 separate occasions. Coaches and fellow competitors saw a young man with discipline, determination, and genuine ability. Had life taken a different turn, there's every chance Brendan Cummins could have been remembered for his achievements inside the ring. Instead, those same skills would one day make him even more dangerous. Because a trained boxer doesn't simply throw punches. He knows exactly where to land them. And when Brendan eventually turned to violence, the consequences were often devastating. As he entered adulthood, the promising young athlete began disappearing behind a growing list of criminal convictions. Violence became a recurring feature of his life. Court records would eventually show convictions for assault, causing harm, possession of knives, threats to kill, and other serious offences. Long before the public heard his name, Gardaí already knew it well. His criminal record continued to grow. By his early 20s, Brendan Cummins was spending more time inside courtrooms than boxing gyms. One particularly serious incident involved a machete attack, while another saw him accused of swinging a samurai sword at a prison officer. The details varied from case to case, but a pattern was beginning to emerge. Conflict, violence, escalation. Every conviction pushed him deeper into the criminal justice system. Eventually, prison became less of an interruption to his life and more of a permanent feature of it. In fact, his barrister would later reveal something extraordinary. From the age of 16 onwards, Brendan Cummins had spent all but 9 months in custody. Think about that for a moment. Imagine entering adulthood almost entirely behind bars. Imagine spending your late teens and 20s surrounded by violence, confrontation, and prison walls. Could anyone come out of that environment unchanged? Or does prison simply harden those who are already on a dangerous path? For Brendan Cummins, prison didn't seem to reduce his violence. If anything, it amplified it. Inside Ireland's prisons, inmates received disciplinary reports for breaking prison rules. These reports are known as P19S. Most prisoners might accumulate a handful during lengthy sentences. Brendan Cummins reportedly amassed 97 separate disciplinary sanctions. That number alone tells its own story. It wasn't one bad day. It wasn't one fight. It represented years of conflict with prison staff, repeated acts of aggression and behaviour that authorities struggled to control. As his disciplinary record grew longer, so too did his reputation. Experienced prison officers began viewing him differently from ordinary inmates. He wasn't simply aggressive, he was unpredictable. And unpredictability is often what frightens experienced officers the most. Because if someone attacks during an argument, there are usually warning signs. Raised voices, threats, anger. But witnesses and officials would later describe Brendan Cummins as someone who sometimes exploded into violence with little or no warning at all. That made every interaction a potential risk. As the incidents mounted, prison authorities concluded that Brendan could no longer remain among the general prison population. Instead, he was placed under some of the strictest conditions available within the Irish prison system. For years, he spent around 23 hours each day confined to his cell. Later, Brendan challenged those conditions through the High Court, arguing that he had effectively been held in solitary confinement for 3.5 years. The Irish Prison Service disputed that description, maintaining that he was being managed under specialist security regimes rather than formal solitary confinement. Whatever terminology was used, the reality remained the same. Brendan Cummins lived under restrictions experienced by very few prisoners. But there was one chilling revelation that perhaps explained why. During psychological assessments, Cummins reportedly admitted that he sometimes deliberately picked fights with prison officers simply because he was bored. Not because he'd been threatened. Not because someone had provoked him. Not because he hoped to escape. Simply because he wanted stimulation. If that's true, it raises an uncomfortable question. How do you safely manage someone whose violence isn't always driven by anger or revenge, but by boredom? For prison staff, there was no easy answer. And before long, Brendan Cummins would become involved in a series of assaults that would cement his reputation as one of the most feared inmates in Ireland's prison system. Those attacks would leave officers seriously injured, force emergency restraint teams into action, and eventually result in Brendan appearing before judges under security measures usually reserved for the country's most dangerous prisoners. And it all began with a single punch that changed everything. The attack happened almost as soon as Brendan Cummins arrived at Portlaoise prison. On the 20th of February 2017, he was transferred from Cloverhill while already in custody on another matter. Like every new arrival, he was brought into a search room where prison officers carried out the standard reception procedures before he could enter the prison. At first, everything appeared routine. His handcuffs were removed. Then, in an instant, everything changed. According to the prosecution, Cummins suddenly launched a single punch at one of the prison officers. It wasn't an ordinary punch. Years of competitive boxing had taught Brendan Cummins exactly how to generate power. The blow shattered the officer's nose, split his inner lip, and immediately threw the room into chaos. Within seconds, alarms were raised. Specially trained prison officers, known as the Contain and Restraint Team, rushed in to bring the situation under control. The court later heard the attack had caused what witnesses described as pandemonium. For the injured officer, the consequences didn't end once the bleeding stopped. He later told investigators that he continued suffering headaches long after the assault, while his sense of smell had been permanently affected by the injuries. Cummins would later offer a very different version of events. During Garda interviews, he claimed the officer had threatened him before removing the handcuffs, allegedly telling him he would leave his eyes black and blue and kick him like a dog. Whatever was said inside that room, the court ultimately accepted the prosecution's case. Judge Patricia Ryan described the assault as particularly serious because it had been carried out by someone trained as a boxer. That wasn't just another prison fight. It was a skilled fighter using years of training against an unsuspecting prison officer. Cummins was sentenced to 3 years in prison, although the final year was suspended after the judge considered his age, his guilty plea, and the additional prison punishments he had already received, including extended periods under highly restrictive conditions. The judge also imposed an unusual order. For the next 25 years, Brendan was prohibited from contacting the prison officer or his family, except where unavoidable inside the prison itself. But remarkably, that wasn't even the only assault Brendan committed against prison staff. On the very same day, another case would later emerge involving an attack on prison governor Ronan Maher. The governor had entered one of the prison yards to speak with another inmate. Nothing suggested violence was about to erupt. There had been no confrontation, no escalating argument, no obvious trigger. Then Brendan Cummins began shouting. Before anyone could react, he stepped forward and punched the governor in the face 3 times. It was another attack that appeared to happen almost without warning. When the case eventually came before the courts, security arrangements spoke louder than any witness ever could. Cummins didn't enter the courtroom under a normal escort. Instead, he was surrounded by 5 prison officers wearing full riot gear, protective helmets, body armor, riot shields. To members of the public watching the proceedings, it looked less like an ordinary criminal case and more like preparations for a violent public disorder. That image alone reinforced the reputation Brendan Cummins had built behind prison walls. Governor Maher later gave evidence about the lasting effects of the assault. Emotionally, he insisted he wasn't shaken. Violence, he said, unfortunately came with the territory of working inside a prison. Physically, however, it was another matter. Long after the attack, he continued experiencing pain in his neck whenever he turned his head. It's a reminder that prison assaults don't simply disappear once the bruises heal. Many officers carry the physical consequences with them for years. As Brendan's disciplinary record continued growing, so did the concern among prison authorities. Court proceedings revealed that he had accumulated an astonishing 97 disciplinary sanctions while in custody. 97. To put that into perspective, many inmates complete lengthy prison sentences without receiving anywhere near that number. For Brendan Cummins, confrontation had become almost routine. Violence followed him wherever he went. And perhaps the most disturbing aspect wasn't the severity of every incident. It was the unpredictability. Psychologists working with Brendan reportedly learned something deeply unsettling. He admitted that he sometimes deliberately provoked confrontations with prison officers simply to relieve boredom. Think about what that means. Most acts of violence have a motive. Revenge, fear, money, status. But boredom? How do you prepare for someone who may attack simply because they want something to happen? It's precisely that unpredictability that makes certain offenders so difficult to manage. Because if there are no warning signs, how can anyone know when the next assault is coming? The answer, for prison authorities, was to change the way Brendan Cummins was managed entirely. He could no longer be treated like an ordinary inmate. Instead, he became one of a very small number of prisoners subjected to extraordinary security measures. Years spent on 23-hour lockdown, specialist supervision, limited contact with other prisoners, enhanced staffing. Every movement carefully planned. Every interaction treated as a potential risk. These measures weren't introduced as punishment alone. They were introduced because prison authorities believed they were necessary to protect everyone inside. Prison officers, healthcare staff, civilian workers, even other inmates. Because prison can be a dangerous place at the best of times. Add someone capable of explosive, unpredictable violence into that environment and the risks increase dramatically. But Brendan Cummins wasn't simply locked away and forgotten. His behaviour became one of the reasons Ireland invested in specialist approaches to managing its most dangerous prisoners. Authorities recognised that traditional prison regimes weren't enough for a handful of exceptionally violent offenders. They needed something different. Something designed specifically for men whose behaviour seemed impossible to predict. That led to the creation of one of the most secure and closely managed areas within the Irish prison system, a place very few inmates would ever see. And it was there that Brendan Cummins would spend much of his time, alongside some of Ireland's most dangerous and psychologically complex prisoners. The question was no longer whether Brendan Cummins was capable of violence. Everyone already knew the answer to that. The real question had become far more difficult. Could anyone stop him from doing it again? For most prisoners, time eventually becomes predictable. They wake up, eat, exercise, return to their cells. Day after day, the routine rarely changes. For Brendan Cummins, however, prison life followed a very different pattern. By now, prison authorities had concluded that he couldn't safely live alongside the general prison population. Every movement had to be carefully managed, every interaction closely monitored, and every decision weighed against one simple question. What if he lashes out again? That question ultimately led Brendan Cummins to one of the most secure environments within the Irish prison system, the National Violence Reduction Unit. It's a place few members of the public have ever seen, and even fewer prisoners will ever enter. Despite its name, it isn't simply another punishment block. Its purpose is very different. The unit was created to house inmates whose behaviour presents an exceptional and ongoing danger. Men who have repeatedly assaulted prison staff, attacked fellow prisoners, or demonstrated such extreme levels of unpredictable violence that ordinary prison wings are no longer considered safe. In many ways, it's the prison system's final attempt to manage offenders who seem almost impossible to control. The officers working there aren't randomly assigned. They're among the most experienced in the Irish prison service. Staffing levels are significantly higher than on ordinary wings, ensuring officers are never left isolated if violence suddenly erupts. Psychologists and behavioural specialists also play an important role, working alongside prison staff to understand what triggers violent behaviour and whether it can be reduced. The goal isn't simply to lock someone away, it's to answer an extraordinarily difficult question. Can someone like Brendan Cummins actually change? Or is the risk simply too great? Because no prison can function if officers fear walking onto a landing. No prison can operate if inmates believe they're constantly at risk of being attacked without warning. And no rehabilitation program can succeed if violence becomes an everyday occurrence. Perhaps that's what made Brendan Cummins such a difficult prisoner to understand. According to reports, he didn't always attack after arguments. Sometimes there was no obvious trigger at all. Psychologists who assessed him reportedly heard him admit that provoking prison officers could relieve boredom. It's a chilling thought. Violence not as revenge, not as self-defense, not even as intimidation, but as entertainment. If that's how someone views conflict, where do you even begin? Do you punish them? Do you isolate them? Do you offer therapy? Or do you accept that some people simply cannot be managed in the same way as everyone else? Those weren't theoretical questions. They were questions prison staff faced every single day. Because unlike the public, prison officers couldn't simply avoid Brendan Cummins. They had to unlock his cell, escort him, search him, speak to him. Every day, every shift, every interaction carried an element of uncertainty. Imagine reporting for work knowing that one of the inmates under your supervision had accumulated almost 100 disciplinary sanctions. Imagine knowing he was a trained boxer. Imagine knowing he had previously assaulted prison staff. Would you ever truly relax? Or would every conversation feel like it could suddenly become a fight? That's exactly why some of the security measures surrounding Brendan Cummins appeared so extraordinary. When he attended court, members of the public saw something they rarely witness. 5 prison officers. Full protective equipment. Visored helmets. Body armour. Riot shields. To someone unfamiliar with the prison system, it looked excessive. Until you understood who they were escorting. Because prison officers don't dress like that for ordinary inmates. Those precautions existed because Brendan had demonstrated, repeatedly, that violence could happen in an instant. One punch had already broken a prison officer's nose. Another attack had left a prison governor with lasting injuries. Other prison staff had suffered burns after boiling water was thrown over them. Each incident reinforced the same conclusion. This wasn't a prisoner who could simply be left to get on with his sentence. His behaviour required constant management. Of course, Brendan Cummins wasn't the only dangerous prisoner Ireland has ever produced. Over the years, the prison system has dealt with a small number of inmates whose violence made them impossible to house on ordinary wings. Some murdered fellow prisoners. Others carried out unprovoked attacks on officers. Some played leading roles in riots and hostage situations that left entire prisons on lockdown. But there's an important distinction. Many of Ireland's most notorious criminals became famous because of organised crime. Drug trafficking, gangland murders, armed robbery. Brendan Cummins earned his reputation for something else entirely, his unpredictability. He wasn't feared because he controlled a criminal empire. He was feared because no one could be certain what he might do next. That unpredictability changes everything inside a prison. It affects where someone lives, who escorts them, how many officers are required, whether they can work alongside other inmates. Even something as routine as opening a cell door becomes a carefully planned operation. And yet, despite all those precautions, the prison service never abandoned the idea that rehabilitation remained possible. The National Violence Reduction Unit wasn't designed solely to contain dangerous men. It was also designed to help them. Behavioural programs, psychological support, conflict management, alternatives to violence workshops. These initiatives encourage prisoners to recognise the moments that lead to aggression before violence takes over. For many inmates, they work remarkably well. Some prisoners genuinely change. Some learn to control impulses that once dominated their lives. Some leave prison determined never to return. But rehabilitation depends on one crucial factor. The prisoner has to want it. That's the challenge. You can't force someone to engage with therapy. You can't force someone to examine years of violent behaviour. And you certainly can't force someone to change if they don't believe they need to. That's what made Brendan Cummins such a difficult case. The prison service could provide every available resource: experienced officers, psychologists, behavioural specialists, structured programs, secure accommodation. But at the end of the day, only Brendan Cummins could decide whether any of it mattered. And for much of his time behind bars, the violence continued. Which raises another uncomfortable question. When someone spends almost their entire adult life inside prison, does prison eventually stop feeling like punishment? Does it simply become home? Remember what his barrister revealed. Since the age of 16, Brendan Cummins had spent only around 9 months outside custody. 9 months. Everything else had been lived behind walls, behind steel doors, behind razor wire. For many people, prison is an interruption to life. For Brendan Cummins, it had become life itself. And after years spent inside Ireland's highest security regimes, there was only one question left. What would happen when those prison gates finally opened? Because eventually, no matter how dangerous a prisoner may be, most sentences come to an end. And when Brendan Cummins was finally released, many people wondered whether the years of restrictions, specialist supervision and psychological intervention had changed him at all. Or whether Ireland's most feared inmate was about to prove that nothing had changed. Eventually, every prison sentence comes to an end. No matter how dangerous an inmate may be, unless they're serving a whole life sentence, there comes a day when the gates open and they're released back into society. For Brendan Cummins, that day finally arrived after years spent under some of the strictest conditions in the Irish prison system. He left prison carrying a reputation that few offenders ever acquire. Not as a gang boss, not as a serial killer, but as a man widely regarded as one of the most dangerous prisoners Ireland had ever had to manage. Reports at the time suggested that Gardaí circulated an alert following his release, reflecting the concern that surrounded his return to the community. For Brendan, it was an opportunity to begin again. At least, that was the hope. Years earlier, his legal team had spoken about his desire to use his boxing experience to help young people once he was released. It was an ambition that, on paper at least, suggested someone looking toward a different future. After spending almost his entire adult life behind bars, perhaps this was the chance to finally leave that life behind. But changing your future is often far more difficult than simply walking out of prison. Old environments, old associates, old habits. They're rarely left behind overnight. Not long after his release, Brendan Cummins found himself back before the courts. This time, the allegations centred on a violent early morning assault in Dundalk. According to the prosecution, the incident began over something surprisingly small: a mobile phone. The court heard that Brendan had been socialising with the eventual victim in the days before the attack. At some point during the evening, Brendan allegedly left his phone behind. The victim found it. Instead of returning it, he reportedly sold it for €40, intending to use the money to buy drugs. When Brendan learned what had happened, he paid €40 to recover the phone. But according to the prosecution, that wasn't the end of the matter. Far from it. In the early hours of the morning, Brendan Cummins and another man made their way to an apartment where the victim was asleep. The court heard they arrived shortly after 6:30 in the morning. Inside the apartment, the victim was allegedly dragged from his bed before being attacked. He told investigators he was struck with a vodka bottle that shattered during the assault, before being punched and kicked as he lay on the floor. The attack continued into the hallway, where he was allegedly dragged and assaulted again. When emergency services arrived, the injured man had already been taken to hospital. He required stitches for his injuries. Although he eventually recovered physically, The court heard he remained fearful and was trying to move on with his life. During Brendan Cummins' arrest, Gardet recovered 2 heavy rings he was allegedly wearing. Investigators described them as not quite amounting to full knuckle dusters, but capable of causing significant injury. Both Brendan Cummins and his co-accused later pleaded guilty to assault causing harm. Once again, Brendan found himself standing before a judge. Once again, violence had brought him back into the criminal justice system. For many people following the case, it raised an obvious question. Had anything really changed? Or had years of imprisonment, isolation, and specialist intervention ultimately failed to alter the course of his life? By this stage, Brendan's criminal record had grown to include dozens of convictions, many involving violence. Court records referred to convictions for assault causing harm, assault, possession of knives, and threats to kill. Behind those convictions sat another statistic that was equally remarkable. Nearly 100 disciplinary sanctions accumulated while in prison. It's difficult to think of many inmates who generated that level of concern from prison authorities over such a prolonged period. Yet even after everything you've heard in this story, Brendan Cummins remains a difficult person to define. On one hand, there is the young boxer, a gifted athlete who won county and provincial titles, someone whose coaches likely imagined a very different future. On the other hand, there is the man who repeatedly assaulted prison officers, who broke a prison officer's nose with a single punch, who attacked a prison governor, who spent years confined under extraordinary security measures because authorities believed he posed an exceptional risk. Both versions of Brendan Cummins existed. The uncomfortable truth is that human beings are rarely as simple as heroes or villains. The court also heard that Brendan's childhood had been marked by violence. He had reportedly witnessed abuse from an early age and experienced circumstances that no child should have to endure. That background may help explain parts of his life, but it doesn't erase responsibility for the choices he made as an adult. Thousands of people endure traumatic childhoods without going on to commit serious violence. Understanding someone's past is not the same as excusing their actions. Perhaps that's why Brendan Cummins continues to provoke such strong opinions. Some see a man who has failed long before he became a prisoner. Others see someone who repeatedly chose violence, even when opportunities to change were placed in front of him. Maybe there's truth in both perspectives. For the Irish Prison Service, however, the debate was never philosophical. It was practical. Their responsibility wasn't to decide why Brendan Cummins behaved the way he did. Their responsibility was to keep people safe. Prison officers deserve to return home to their families at the end of every shift. Other prisoners deserve to serve their sentences without fearing unprovoked attacks. Medical staff, psychologists, and civilian workers deserve to carry out their jobs without becoming targets. Balancing those responsibilities while respecting the rights of even the most violent offenders remains one of the greatest challenges facing any prison system. Brendan Cummins became one of the clearest examples of just how difficult that balance can be. His story isn't simply about one violent prisoner. It's about the limits of punishment, the limits of rehabilitation, and the uncomfortable reality that some offenders present risks that no prison system can ever completely eliminate. Even today, his name continues to be associated with one of the most formidable reputations in the Irish prison system. Whether that reputation was entirely deserved or amplified over years of media coverage is something people will continue to debate. But one fact is beyond dispute. Very few prisoners leave behind a legacy that changes the way prison officers think about safety. Brendan Cummins did. And perhaps that's the most revealing part of this entire story. Not the convictions. Not the headlines. Not even the assaults. But the fact that one man forced an entire system to adapt around him. So, after hearing Brendan Cummins' story from beginning to end, what do you think? Do you believe someone with a history like his can ever truly leave violence behind? Or are there some offenders whose behaviour becomes so deeply ingrained that prison can only ever contain the danger, not remove it? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed this documentary and you'd like to see more deep dives into Britain's and Ireland's most notorious criminals, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a future upload. Until next time, thanks for watching.